So there you are. You're climbing Kili. It's day 3. You're going via the Sheila route, which, as you know, is my favorite. And you're staying at the Sheila campsite, which is at 3,800 meters. And you haven't been able to sleep all night because you've got a headache. Should you be worried? Before we answer that, here's a good picture of us climbing the Barranca wall late morning on the ascent to Kili. So, we're going to get on to the business of acute altitude illnesses, which are specifically caused by hypobaric hypoxia. Initially, we're going to talk about 4 conditions: high altitude headache, acute mountain sickness, high altitude cerebral edema, and high altitude pulmonary edema. And in fact, the first 3 are probably simply the same condition at extreme ends of the spectrum. We'll talk about that more in further slides. Okay, high altitude headache. Generally speaking, this occurs to at least 80% of people who ascend to high altitude, and normally will develop within 24 hours of ascent over around 2,500 meters. It's usually worse at night, and provided that you are acclimatizing well, it will usually resolve relatively quickly. Most people will just require some simple paracetamol or ibuprofen and to maintain adequate hydration. Ultimately, if you've got a headache and it doesn't improve, and it's a simple high altitude headache, it will usually improve if you return to lower altitude. In fact, whilst I stated here that around 80% of people will develop it, in my experience it's probably closer to 100%, in that virtually everybody gets a degree of headache at some point in ascending to altitude. But this is different to acute mountain sickness. Acute mountain sickness is defined as an acute, self-limiting condition in previously healthy individuals ascending rapidly to high altitude. And to define it further, in the setting of a recent gain in altitude, you need the presence of headache and at least one of the following: anorexia, nausea or vomiting, fatigue or weakness, dizziness or lightheadedness, and disturbed sleep. And you need a score of 3+ on the Rekhaii score. Now, the Rekhaii score is a scoring system that is designed to try and categorize the severity of symptoms caused by high altitude. And I'll show you a slide on the Rekhaii scoring system shortly. However, one of the difficulties with diagnosing acute mountain sickness, particularly in the early stages, is that a lot of the symptomology is relatively non-specific. If you've ever been on a high altitude expedition, or indeed if you've ever been on any kind of long trekking based expedition, you'll recognize that things such as anorexia, nausea, general fatigue, weakness, disturbed sleep are actually not that uncommon in the form of sort of symptomology. Here's the Rekhaii score, and all it does is it takes these symptoms and categorizes into severity and attributes a number. So, for example, if you take difficulty sleeping, you get a score of 0 if you slept well, a score of 1 if you didn't sleep as well as usual, and a score of 2 if you woke many times during the nights with a significantly disturbed sleep. You can see that the classification is actually a little bit subjective. For example, with dizziness and lightheadedness, you score differently for mild, moderate, and severe, but people's interpretation of mild to moderate might actually be quite subjective. Okay, the headache in AMS is throbbing, it's bitemporal or occipital, it feels like a severe band around your head, it's worse at night, it's worse in the early morning, and it's worse lying down or on physical exertion or if you undertake a Valsalva. If you think about that, these are symptoms or features that are very typical of a headache caused by increased intracranial pressure. And fundamentally, that is the cause of AMS. And I'll talk about that a bit more soon. Sleep disturbance is common in association with AMS, and you do get frequent waking, and you do get something called periodic breathing, which is essentially a form of chain stoking induced by high altitude hypoxia. Now, the pathophysiology of periodic breathing is very complex, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but fundamentally what happens is you gradually hyperventilate, and as you hyperventilate, you reach a point where you suddenly stop breathing, you get an apneic period, and then you start to breathe up, and then as you breathe up, you start to hyperventilate until you have another apneic period. So very typical and very similar pattern to chain stoking. And it's due to significant changes in regards to your responses to both carbon dioxide and the hypoxic environment that you're in. The main aspect of periodic breathing is that it disturbs sleep significantly. And if you don't sleep well, you don't generally acclimatize well. Other things that happen in AMS, you get a loss of altitude-related diuresis, and you do have often associated peripheral edema, although these are kind of lesser features and not of such great significance as the headache and the potential progression to high-altitude cerebral edema. The risk factors for developing AMS are obviously the altitude at which you sleep, the rate of ascent, and we've already talked about optimal rates of ascent previously, how long you're exposed to high altitude, whether you've had previous exposure to high altitude before you've come to this current altitude, and to some extent how much you physically exert yourself, although interestingly enough, there does not appear to be a relationship between physical fitness per se and AMS. The other thing that's worth noting is that as you get older, you tend to have a slightly increased risk of protection against the development of AMS. And that makes sense if you think about the fact that AMS is fundamentally due to cerebral edema, because of course as you get older the brain shrinks and therefore the CSF to brain ratio changes, and there is greater capacity within your cranial cavity to effectively compensate for small increases in intracranial pressure. There's also some suspicion that those of the female gender or those that are morbidly obese may have an increased risk of AMS, but that's not definitively proven. And we've already talked before about how there is very significant individual susceptibility and obviously a whole range of genetic factors that probably influence your AMS risk. So as we've said, the pathophysiology of AMS is essentially one of increased cerebral blood flow and increased intracranial pressure, ultimately resulting in cerebral edema as we progress from simple AMS to high-altitude cerebral edema. MRI studies have in fact shown that hypoxia causes generalized vasogenic edema, but in the context of AMS there appears to also be additional cytotoxic edema. Regardless, at the end of the day, high-altitude cerebral edema is the end stage of AMS. So AMS can be considered to be due to mild cerebral edema and HACE, basically severe cerebral edema. And we define HACE in two ways. In the setting of a recent gain in altitude, it's either a change in mental status and or ataxia in a patient who's known to have already had AMS, or both mental status change and ataxia in a person without AMS.